Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you are hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you are watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. The wind whipped through the narrow streets of Montpelier, rattling the old shutters of houses that had stood for over a century. Snow crunched under the boots of a solitary figure walking past the cemetery gates, their breath fogging in the frigid night air. Lanterns flickered along the path, casting long, wavering shadows over the gravestones, each one silent but heavy with stories. Emma Calder paused before a familiar stone, her gloved hands brushing the etched letters. "Abigail Harper," she whispered, voice trembling. It had been nearly 40 years since her childhood friend vanished without a trace, yet the memory remained sharp, like shards of glass lodged in her mind. How could someone disappear in a town this small, this quiet? How could decades pass with no answers, no justice? The cold seeped into her bones, but she barely noticed. Her fingers lingered on the polished surface of the headstone, tracing the outline of the letters as if by touch she could summon the past. Emma remembered that day vividly, the laughter that had once filled Abigail's kitchen, the smell of cinnamon from freshly baked cookies, the excitement in her eyes as she spoke about moving to Boston for her dream job. And then, the silence. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned sharply, heart hammering, but the path was empty. Just the wind, she told herself. Just the wind carrying a whisper of memory, teasing the edges of something long buried. She crouched, brushing away the thin layer of frost on the grave, revealing the flowers that had survived another winter. Plastic petals, faded to muted pink, but stubbornly resilient. Like the hope she hadn't let go of all these years. Somewhere deep in the shadows of the cemetery, a faint light flickered, too deliberate to be a passing car. Emma's pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as a figure stepped into view, silhouetted against the dim glow. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the figure spoke, voice low, almost reverent. "Emma Calder." She froze. Her name, spoken aloud after all these years, carried weight she hadn't realized she was still holding. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The figure stepped closer, revealing an old notebook in hand. "It's about Abigail. They think it's finally solved." Emma's stomach dropped. 39 years. 39 long, empty years. And now, finally, someone had come forward. Someone had found the missing piece of a puzzle that had haunted her entire life. She took a shaky breath, gripping the notebook like a lifeline. What do you mean?" The light flickered again, and the figure held it higher, illuminating pages filled with notes, photographs, and scribbled names. The smell of aged paper mingled with the crisp winter air, an unexpected bridge between past and present. "Everything they missed back then, we've found it now," the figure said, voice firm but tinged with awe. "It's time. Time to know the truth." Emma felt a strange mix of dread and relief. Part of her had imagined this moment countless times, but she hadn't expected the weight of reality to feel so heavy. How many more lives had been affected by Abigail's disappearance? How many secrets had lain hidden beneath the calm streets of Montpelier? And most importantly, who had taken her friend, and why had it taken nearly 40 years to uncover? The wind howled again, and for a moment, it sounded like whispers, faint but insistent, urging her forward. Emma closed her eyes, letting the cold bite at her cheeks as she steadied herself. Tonight, the past would no longer be silent. Tonight, the story of Abigail Harper, and the long shadow it had cast, would finally begin to unfold. The figure handed her the notebook. Emma opened it, and the first photograph made her gasp. A snapshot of a street corner, frozen in time, with a shadow she knew all too well lurking at its edge. And in that instant, the chill of the Vermont winter was nothing compared to the icy realization settling in her chest. After nearly 40 years, the hunt for the truth was finally beginning. Abigail Harper had always been the kind of person who seemed to carry warmth with her, even in the coldest corners of Montpelier. Her laughter was easy, ringing like a bell through the hallways of her childhood home, and she had a way of making everyone she met feel seen, even on days when the world seemed determined to overlook them. Those who knew her remember the quiet intensity behind her green eyes, the spark of curiosity that drove her to ask questions no one else thought to ask, the way she lingered in conversation as if every word held a hidden clue to the universe. Born in 1957, Abigail was the youngest of 3 children, raised in a modest home on a tree-lined street just outside downtown Montpelier. Her parents, Martha and Thomas Harper, were fixtures in the community, her mother a nurse at the local clinic, her father a machinist at a small factory. They encouraged her to explore her interests, from her early love of painting to her fascination with photography, which she pursued with quiet dedication through high school. Abigail's family remembers a precocious child with a notebook perpetually in hand, sketching the world around her with meticulous care. By the time she reached her early 20s, Abigail had already carved out a reputation as both ambitious and compassionate. She worked at the local library, where she organized community reading programs for children, and on weekends, she volunteered at the shelter downtown. Her friends describe her as someone who made time for everyone, whether that meant staying late to help a student research a project or offering her own savings to support a neighbor in need. She had this way of making you believe anything was possible, said Carol Jenkins, a childhood friend who still lives in Montpelier. Even when I was at my lowest, she'd somehow convince me that tomorrow could be better. She believed in people in a way that was almost dangerous because it made you believe in yourself too. Abigail's personal life reflected her independent spirit. She was deeply devoted to her friends but cautious in romance, often preferring meaningful connection over fleeting affection. Those closest to her remember her speaking of dreams beyond the borders of Vermont, a move to Boston to attend art school, a desire to see the world and bring back stories and sketches, and perhaps, one day, to open a small gallery where she could nurture other young artists. She had this quiet determination, said her older brother, David Harper. Abigail was never satisfied with the easy path. She wanted to create something lasting, something that mattered. She wanted to leave a mark on the world, and she had the talent and the heart to do it. Yet, like so many vibrant lives, Abigail's story was not without tension. Friends recall a few subtle warning signs in the months leading up to her disappearance, someone following her on evening walks, a few strange phone calls, and the occasional uneasy glance over her shoulder. But Montpelier in the late 1980s was a small, trusting town. Suspicion felt unnatural. Danger seemed remote, almost inconceivable in a community built on neighborly trust. The night before she vanished, Abigail had stayed late at the library, helping a student complete a research paper. She walked home under a silver-gray sky, the street slippery with early frost. A friend called to check in, and Abigail's cheerful voice answered, assuring them she'd be home in minutes. That would be the last time anyone heard from her. Abigail's absence sent ripples through the town almost immediately. Her parents reported her missing within hours, and the community rallied, combing streets and forests alike in a desperate search. Posters went up in shop windows, church congregations held vigils, and neighbors knocked on doors hoping for a glimpse of the young woman whose presence had become a quiet, unspoken part of their daily lives. She wasn't just someone you knew, she was someone who made Montpelier feel like a place worth living in, said Pastor Simon Carlyle, who had known Abigail since childhood. When she disappeared, it wasn't just her family who suffered, the whole town felt the emptiness. The case quickly became the focal point of local rumor and speculation. People whispered about strangers in town, about old grudges, and about secrets some might rather keep hidden. Yet for Abigail's family, the unknown was unbearable. Every day without news felt like an eternity, and every lead that went cold deepened the sense of helplessness. Her mother, Martha, became a fixture at the police station, poring over maps and timelines, convinced that a detail, no matter how small, would unlock the truth. Her father, Thomas, retreated into work, building mechanical models in the evenings to keep his hands busy while his mind raced through scenarios he could not control. Her disappearance did not just leave a void, it reshaped lives. David Harper, who had been considering a move out of state, stayed behind to help his parents, postponing dreams of his own to search for his sister. Friends lost faith in their routines, haunted by the question of whether they had missed a clue, a call, a signal. Abigail had been the hub of a small but tight-knit network, and without her, the connections frayed, leaving silence in its place. Yet even in absence, Abigail's presence lingered. The library held her mark, the carefully organized shelves, the notes in margins of borrowed books, the art she had hung on walls with quiet pride. Her favorite bench by the river, where she had sketched for hours, became a spot of memory and mourning. The town did not just lose a person, it lost a force of kindness and creativity, someone whose life had subtly but irrevocably shaped the community around her. And then there were the questions that refused to leave anyone's mind. Who would take someone so vibrant and full of life? Why had the town's safety, its trust, been violated in such a brutal, inexplicable way? Could anyone responsible have hidden among them all these years, blending in with the people who still walked past Abigail's favorite cafe, who still laughed in the streets where she once played? Abigail Harper's life was a mosaic of warmth, ambition, and compassion, broken suddenly, leaving a void felt far beyond the walls of her family home. But the truth, buried under layers of time and forgotten trails, was waiting. The clues that had been overlooked, the secrets whispered behind closed doors, and the shadows that had lingered at the edge of memory all pointed to a story the town was not yet ready to hear. It would take nearly 40 years, decades of questions and heartbreak, for Abigail's life, and her loss, to finally guide investigators to the answers Montpelier had been seeking for generations. The week before Abigail Harper disappeared seemed ordinary, even mundane, in the quiet rhythm of Montpelier life. But as investigators pieced together the timeline decades later, each small detail formed a pattern that would ultimately make sense only in hindsight. Monday, February 1, 1987. Abigail arrived at the library early, as was her habit. The morning sun filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above stacks of books. She greeted her colleagues with her usual warmth, joking with the new assistant about misfiled records and overdue books. That afternoon, she met with a local student, Michael Avery, to help him research Vermont history for a school project. Michael remembered her encouraging him to dig deeper, insisting that facts often hid in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to find them. Her neighbor, Mrs. Lillian Pratt, saw Abigail briefly in the late afternoon, walking home with a canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder. She looked cheerful, Mrs. Pratt recalled decades later, in a post-breakthrough interview. Her scarf was wrapped tight, and she waved at me. I never thought that would be the last time I'd see her alive. Tuesday, February 2nd. Abigail spent much of the day sorting newly arrived books at the library and helping the staff organize an upcoming children's reading program. She had planned a brief visit to the nearby market afterward but decided against it when the skies turned gray with an incoming winter storm. Later that evening, she called her mother, Martha Harper, to discuss the painting she was working on. They talked for nearly 20 minutes, a conversation filled with quiet laughter and encouragement. Unknown to Abigail, someone had been watching the library parking lot that week. Security footage, later recovered from a nearby store, showed a figure loitering near the entrance during the late afternoon, pacing in a way that suggested more than casual curiosity. At the time, no one paid much attention. Montpelier was a town where strangers were usually just strangers. Wednesday, February 3rd. Abigail ran errands in town, stopping by the post office and a small cafe near Main Street. Witnesses remembered her friendly interactions, chatting briefly with the cashier, offering a coin to a child outside the cafe, but also noticed subtle tension. One man, who preferred to remain unnamed, recalled seeing a strange van parked near the cafe for much of the morning. It had no Vermont plates, and the driver never entered the building. He mentioned it to a coworker, but no one connected the presence of a vehicle to Abigail Harper's disappearance decades later. That evening, Abigail attended a small art circle meeting at the community center. Friends remember her talking enthusiastically about a series of sketches she had been developing, a project meant to capture the quiet streets and landscapes of Vermont winters. But someone in the back of the room seemed unusually focused on her, lingering long after the others had left. Abigail had smiled politely, nodding, but the unease in that glance would later be revisited in old statements during the reopened investigation. Thursday, February 4th. This was the day Abigail was last seen in public. She left her apartment around 8:15 a.m., bundled in a gray coat and scarf, carrying her tote bag filled with sketchbooks and library notes. Neighbors saw her walking briskly toward the library, her steps purposeful. Around 9:30 a.m., she helped organize a delivery of donated books and chatted with the library trustee, Mr. Harold Jensen, about plans for a literacy drive. According to his later testimony, Abigail had seemed completely normal, even excited, discussing a potential art exhibit. However, something in her demeanor caught his attention. A fleeting glance over her shoulder, a pause mid-sentence, as though she had sensed someone observing her. He dismissed it at the time. Montpelier winters were cold and windy, and it was easy for anyone passing by to appear momentarily unnerving. The last hours. Abigail left the library around 5:20 p.m., intending to walk home. She made a brief stop at a small corner store, buying milk and bread, before vanishing into the early twilight. Witnesses later recounted a dark sedan parked on a side street near her route. The driver remained in the vehicle, unmoving, watching the street. At the time, no one connected the car to Abigail's disappearance. Her last known phone call was to a friend, Diane Roberts. At approximately 6:05 p.m. Diane remembered the conversation vividly. Abigail's voice was warm, familiar, but slightly distracted. She mentioned the storm approaching, that she would be home soon, and laughed about a minor mishap at the library. Diane had heard nothing unusual, but retrospectively, detectives would note the distracted tone, a subtle indicator that something had unsettled Abigail that evening. Immediate surroundings. Neighbors later described unusual activity on the street, footprints in the fresh snow that seemed to stop abruptly, tire tracks in odd positions, and an unfamiliar set of muddy boot prints near the alley behind Abigail's building. These details, largely dismissed at the time, were revisited decades later when forensic teams compared them to the suspect's known shoe and tire patterns. Multiple perspectives. Friends recall her routine and her excitement about small projects. They note subtle changes in behavior, slight wariness, quick glances over her shoulder, unexplained cancellations of casual plans, but did not perceive a real threat. Family, Martha and Thomas Harper remember that week as typical, yet when reviewing old letters and phone records during the reopened investigation, they noted odd calls from unknown numbers and cryptic messages that were previously ignored. Neighbors, some noticed strangers in town who seemed out of place, including a man seen near the library and the cafe, and a vehicle parked unusually. These were written off at the time as coincidences, but later investigations revealed the same figure had been tracking Abigail for several days. Law enforcement, 1987 officers initially treated her disappearance as a runaway case. Missing person protocols were limited, early leads were scattered, and resources were thin. Investigators conducted interviews but found no concrete evidence, leaving the case frustratingly cold. The foreshadowing of danger. Unbeknownst to Abigail, someone had been following her for at least a week. Surveillance footage recovered in the reopened investigation showed a figure appearing at different locations she frequented: library, cafe, art circle. Handwritten notes from a local witness hinted at an individual asking subtle, pointed questions about Abigail's schedule. Small incidents, dismissed in isolation, painted a picture that would eventually lead detectives straight to the suspect. The night she vanished. By the evening of February 4, 1987, Abigail had disappeared without a trace. Her apartment remained untouched, her belongings in place, save for her coat, scarf, and tote bag left by the door. Friends and family assumed she might have stayed with someone unexpectedly, or that travel delays had kept her late. But deep down, Martha Harper recalls, "I knew, somehow, that something was terribly wrong." The timeline of those last days, meticulously reconstructed decades later, revealed the first strands of a sinister pattern. Each ordinary action, walking home from the library, stopping for groceries, attending a meeting, intersected with someone else's dark plan. Every casual glance, every unremarkable vehicle, every small, fleeting interaction became a clue in a puzzle that would take nearly 40 years to solve. The question haunting investigators then, and haunting Montpelier to this day, was simple yet terrifying: who had watched Abigail Harper so closely, and why had the town's quiet streets become the stage for a life-ending crime? The morning of February 5, 1987, began like any other in Montpelier, icy fog clinging to tree branches, the muted glow of the sun barely cutting through the winter gray. But for Martha Harper, Abigail's mother, the day would shatter the fragile hope that had lingered through a sleepless night. Martha had woken early, compelled by an uneasy instinct she couldn't shake. Something about her daughter's absence felt wrong, more urgent than a missed phone call or delayed arrival. She bundled herself in a heavy coat, boots crunching in the frost, and decided to walk the short distance to Abigail's favorite riverside trail. It was a path Abigail often took for sketching and reflection, a place where the quiet of Vermont winters felt almost sacred. As Martha approached the trail, she noticed something immediately out of place. The snow, freshly fallen overnight, bore a set of footprints she did not recognize. They led to a small copse of trees near the riverbank and then abruptly stopped. Her heart quickened, and a cold dread settled over her chest. She called out, "Abigail?" Her voice trembled against the stillness, swallowed by the wind. There was no answer, only the faint rustle of branches and the distant call of a crow. Then she saw it. Abigail's body lay partially obscured by a thin drift of snow, her coat pulled slightly aside. Martha froze, unable to comprehend what her eyes were telling her. The figure of her daughter, so vibrant just days ago, now lay still and impossibly small against the pale winter ground. "Abigail!" she cried, dropping to her knees, brushing snow from her daughter's face in disbelief. Her tears froze on her cheeks as the full weight of the scene settled in. Abigail's positioning was strange. She was lying on her side, arms bent at odd angles, as if she had tried to protect herself but had been forced into an unnatural pose. Her head rested against a small boulder, her eyes partially open, staring at nothing. Investigators later noted the contradiction between her apparent struggle and the lack of defensive injuries on her hands, a detail that would puzzle forensic teams for decades. Several objects were missing from the scene. Her tote bag, normally slung over her shoulder and filled with sketchbooks and library notes, was gone. Her scarf, a vibrant green she always wore in winter, had disappeared as well. Yet the simplest, most personal items, her wedding ring, she had never married, and a small locket she always carried, remained in place, suggesting the perpetrator had taken only what they deemed valuable or significant. The ground around her body told another story. Footprints indicated she had been approached from two directions, one set leading away into the trees, another stopping abruptly near the riverbank. Tiny scuffs and disturbed snow suggested a brief struggle, but there were no drag marks. Her coat, partially zipped, showed unusual abrasions, as if snagged on branches, or perhaps by the hands of someone she knew. A faint scent, metallic and sharp, lingered in the air, later identified as trace amounts of an unusual chemical not native to the immediate area, further deepening the mystery. When the first responders arrived, the scene was chaotic yet eerily quiet. Officers carefully cordoned off the area, their boots leaving new tracks alongside the original ones. One young officer later recalled the unnerving stillness of the place. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. Like it knew the story hadn't been told yet. The coroner, Dr. Lewis, noted early on the contradictory forensic traces. There were faint marks on Abigail's wrists that could have been restraints, yet they were inconsistent with rope or cord. Her shoes were clean, with minimal snow residue, despite the surrounding frost, suggesting she had been moved after death. Small fragments of fabric not matching her clothing were found clinging to her coat, later determined to originate from another unknown garment. Even decades later, these anomalies puzzled investigators, who recognized the perpetrator's meticulous attention to detail. Witnesses trickled in as word spread. A jogger who often ran the river path in the mornings described a dark sedan parked at the far edge of the trail, its engine off, driver absent. He had assumed it belonged to a fisherman or hiker and moved on. It wasn't until the reopened investigation that the vehicle's significance became clear. It had been the same car spotted by neighbors days earlier, a shadow stalking Abigail's movements. The media arrived swiftly, drawn to the tragedy of a young woman taken in a town that had once prided itself on safety and trust. Reporters crowded the perimeter, cameras flashing against the snow, capturing the raw grief on Martha's face. The contrast between the peaceful winter morning and the violent, inexplicable loss stunned the community. Parents kept children home from school, neighbors whispered in doorways, and Montpelier's quiet streets were suddenly alive with fear and speculation. Among the investigators, questions piled up faster than answers. Why had Abigail been targeted? Who had approached her from two directions, leaving no trace of escape? Why were some personal items taken while others remained untouched? And perhaps most puzzling of all, why had no one seen the crime occur, given the open visibility of the Riverside Trail? Martha Harper, kneeling by her daughter's side, remembered thinking the worst. Who would do this to someone so kind, so bright? How could anyone destroy a life that had done nothing but give? Her grief was raw, visceral, and immediate. Even decades later, she described that moment as frozen in time, the shock and despair still vivid in her mind. Detectives documented the scene with painstaking care. Photographs captured Abigail's position from multiple angles, sketches mapped the surrounding terrain, noting tree branches, rocks, and subtle slopes, and snow samples were collected in case microscopic evidence could provide leads. They interviewed early witnesses, joggers, neighbors, and delivery workers. Everyone's memories, though fragmented, painted a picture of an ordinary morning forever tainted by violence. The inconsistencies were glaring. The partial movement of the body suggested familiarity with human anatomy, someone who understood how to stage a scene to confuse investigators. The selective removal of items indicated forethought, an understanding of what investigators might consider relevant or personal. And the faint chemical residue hinted at planning, premeditation, and a methodical approach that terrified law enforcement even in those early days. By the end of the day, Abigail Harper's disappearance had become a full-fledged investigation, officially a homicide. The town was left grappling with the realization that someone among them, or someone who had watched from the shadows, had shattered the sense of security they had long taken for granted. For her family, the discovery of her body confirmed their deepest fears. For investigators, the contradictory details were both a roadblock and a roadmap, signaling a case that would challenge conventional methods and endure for nearly 4 decades before answers could finally surface. And somewhere in the quiet town, unnoticed by all but a few, a shadow watched the perimeter, retreating as the police arrived, leaving behind the faintest trace of a presence that would puzzle detectives for years to come. Initial investigation: Vermont murder solved after nearly 40 years. The early days of the investigation into Abigail Harper's disappearance were a flurry of activity, yet marked by frustration, gaps in technology, and the limitations of small-town policing. Montpelier, while charming and quiet, lacked the sophisticated forensic resources that larger cities could bring to bear. For the local sheriff's department, every lead was precious, and yet every path seemed to twist into uncertainty. Police procedures and forensic limitations. Detectives arrived at the Riverside Trail hours after Martha Harper's discovery. They meticulously photographed Abigail's body and the surrounding area, marking footprints, vehicle tracks, and disturbed snow. Officers noted the unusual positioning of her body and the missing items, the tote bag and scarf, and carefully bagged all recovered evidence. Forensics in 1987, however, had limits. DNA analysis was rudimentary. Trace fibers and microscopic residues could only be examined using less sensitive techniques. Blood spatter analysis existed but was neither precise nor widely practiced. Investigators could test for fingerprints and perform rudimentary chemical analyses, but much of the subtle evidence that would later become key was, at the time, beyond their reach. Detectives canvassed the area, questioning neighbors, joggers, and local shopkeepers. Statements were taken in hurried, sometimes chaotic conditions. Witnesses were asked to recall details they had barely noticed the day before: what someone wore, the make of a car, the direction of footprints. In some cases, minor inconsistencies appeared almost immediately. One neighbor claimed they had seen Abigail pass the library around 5:15 p.m., while another swore she had left closer to 5:30. A jogger reported a dark sedan near the trail, while a delivery worker remembered no vehicles at all. These contradictions, small at first, compounded into a haze of uncertainty that would plague the investigation for months. Forensic experts were consulted, but the absence of sophisticated tools left questions unanswered. Tiny fabric fragments clung to Abigail's coat, but their origin could not be traced definitively. Chemical residues detected near the scene hinted at unusual substances, but laboratories lacked databases to identify them accurately. Footwear impressions were photographed, yet the prints themselves were weathered and incomplete. In short, every clue they collected had potential, but none could immediately be linked to a suspect. Eyewitness contradictions and town rumors. As news of Abigail's disappearance spread, Montpelier became a town divided by speculation. Eyewitness accounts conflicted not just on time, but on behavior, vehicle descriptions, and even the presence of strangers in town. One neighbor described a man lingering near the library several days before the disappearance. Another denied ever seeing anyone unusual. A third insisted a suspicious figure had been near Abigail's apartment late at night, though no patrol had reported such a presence. Rumors ignited almost immediately. Some whispered about a drifter passing through town, a man no one knew but everyone remembered seeing. Others speculated that Abigail had run off voluntarily, citing her independent nature and desire to travel. A few suggested darker possibilities: someone from town with a hidden grudge, perhaps a jealous suitor, or someone who had followed her from Boston. Cafes and grocery stores buzzed with speculation, each rumor quietly altering the collective memory of the town. Even those closest to Abigail were not immune. Friends questioned themselves endlessly. Did they notice something unusual? Did they miss a signal of distress? Each unanswered question magnified the sense of guilt and helplessness. It was a collective tension that gave the town a lingering unease, one that would not lift until decades later when the breakthrough finally emerged. Early suspects and ambiguity. From the outset, investigators had a handful of persons of interest, though none could be charged at the time. There were neighbors who had known Abigail personally, colleagues at the library who had clashed with her over schedules, and local men whose minor infractions had placed them near the scene. All were questioned, some multiple times, but the lack of concrete evidence prevented further action. One early suspect, a man who frequently traveled the Vermont countryside for work, aroused attention because he had been seen near Abigail's apartment on the day she disappeared. He was cooperative with police but could not provide a verifiable alibi for the hours surrounding her last sighting. A second person of interest, a young man with a reputation for petty theft, had been noticed loitering near the river path, yet there was no direct evidence linking him to the scene. Both individuals were released, though files were kept open on them for follow-up should new evidence appear. Investigators also explored possible outside connections. Abigail had been planning to apply to art programs in Boston, and police considered whether a distant acquaintance or someone following her ambitions might have tracked her movements. This line of inquiry yielded little. No letters, phone calls, or sightings provided a clear link. Even mundane explanations, misunderstood meetings, unreported visitors, added noise to the investigation, obscuring the real trail. The weight of time. By the end of the first week, the investigation had gathered a detailed record of events, statements, and evidence, yet no suspect had emerged. Detectives knew they were working against time. Witnesses' memories were already beginning to fade, and snow and weather had erased some tracks. Townspeople, initially cooperative, grew anxious or defensive, unsure whom to trust. The early missteps, missed clues, overlooked discrepancies, and reliance on imperfect forensics would haunt the investigation for decades. Despite this, the groundwork was crucial. Officers meticulously recorded statements, noting inconsistencies and correlations that might be meaningful years later. Files were catalogued, photographs preserved, and early sketches drawn to capture Abigail's last known positions. Although the investigation seemed to stall, the framework established during these initial weeks would later allow breakthroughs when new technology and methods emerged. A town in suspense. For Montpelier, the investigation became more than a professional exercise, it was a social and emotional trial. Parents worried about the safety of children walking to school, shopkeepers watched unfamiliar faces with suspicion, and even casual conversations carried undertones of fear. The disappearance of Abigail Harper was no longer just a family tragedy, it was a community wound, a violation of the implicit trust that had defined the town for generations. The contradictions in eyewitness testimony, the town's growing web of rumor, and the early suspects, all carefully documented but ultimately inconclusive, set the stage for decades of silence. The investigation, though thorough within the limits of its time, highlighted the challenges of small-town law enforcement confronting a meticulously planned crime. Even as the files were closed temporarily, and Abigail's case slipped into the cold files of unsolved mysteries, the pieces, though seemingly scattered and contradictory, would remain. Every misstep, every overlooked detail, every ambiguous lead would eventually become part of a puzzle that investigators, decades later, would finally solve. The question hanging over Montpelier in those first weeks, and in every town discussion for years after, remained simple and impossible to answer at the time. Who had taken Abigail Harper, and why had someone so young, so full of life, vanished without a trace? Dead ends and the toll on families. Vermont murder solved after nearly 40 years. In the months following Abigail Harper's disappearance, the initial flurry of investigation slowly gave way to frustration and heartache. Leads that had once seemed promising fizzled into dead ends, and the small, trusting town of Montpelier began to feel the weight of a mystery that refused to resolve. For Abigail's family, every cleared suspect, every overlooked clue, and every unanswered question became another layer of grief, slowly eroding the fragile structure of daily life. Early suspects cleared or overlooked. Detectives had pursued multiple avenues, following the threads that evidence and eyewitness testimony suggested. One early suspect, a man who had been seen near Abigail's apartment and matched vague descriptions provided by neighbors, was thoroughly investigated. Police reviewed his alibi, interviewed friends and family, and examined his vehicle. Ultimately, nothing tied him conclusively to the crime. He was released, though officers noted his proximity to the scene and kept records on file for future reference. To the family, every cleared suspect brought both relief and renewed anxiety. Relief that the wrong person wouldn't face punishment, anxiety because the true perpetrator remained at large. Another suspect had a reputation in the community for minor thefts and odd behavior. He had been spotted near the Riverside Trail in the days leading up to Abigail's disappearance. Officers questioned him extensively, but he provided plausible explanations for his whereabouts. Once again, there was no tangible evidence. This repeated pattern, persons of interest emerging and then being dismissed, cast a shadow over the investigation, creating a sense of futility. Yet some clues were overlooked entirely. The dark sedan spotted by neighbors and joggers in the days before Abigail vanished went largely untraced at the time. Fabric fragments found on her coat, later discovered to be a key forensic clue, were catalogued but not analyzed with the precision that modern DNA testing would allow. The faint chemical residue, inexplicable and out of place, was noted but not understood. These oversights were not negligence, they were the limits of 1980s forensic science, but in hindsight, they were the puzzle pieces the audience could already see forming a picture that the investigators would not complete for decades. Impact on loved ones. For Abigail's family, the emotional toll was immediate and enduring. Martha Harper, her mother, had become consumed by the search for answers. Days and nights blurred together as she pored over police reports, retraced Abigail's steps, and answered endless calls from neighbors, reporters, and well-meaning acquaintances offering theories and advice. Sleep became intermittent, and Martha's health began to deteriorate. She developed anxiety that kept her awake for long hours, replaying scenarios in her mind, imagining each possibility of what had happened to her daughter. Thomas Harper, Abigail's father, struggled in a different way. Once a man of routine and stoicism, he withdrew into work, repairing machinery and focusing on tasks that required his hands but not his heart. He found it unbearable to confront the emptiness left in the home, the quiet absence of his daughter's laughter. He often retreated into the garage late at night, listening to the hum of motors and the clink of tools, a private attempt to drown the ache that would not subside. David Harper, Abigail's older brother, faced his own burden. He had considered moving out of Vermont to pursue work opportunities, but after Abigail vanished, he stayed behind to help care for their parents and assist with the investigation. In doing so, he sacrificed his own dreams, becoming a pillar for the family even as he wrestled with feelings of helplessness and guilt. "I should have been paying more attention," he would later admit, years before the breakthrough. "Even now, I wonder if I could have done something differently." The ripple effects extended beyond immediate family. Abigail's closest friends struggled to maintain normalcy. Carol Jenkins, her childhood friend, became withdrawn, plagued by what ifs. Every time she walked past the library, she remembered Abigail's bright eyes and encouraging words. Her own sense of safety eroded. She stopped walking alone, fearing that a similar fate could befall her. Diane Roberts, who had spoken to Abigail the evening she disappeared, experienced recurring nightmares for years, replaying the distracted tone in her friend's last call. Each night, she would awaken with the unsettling sense that she had somehow missed a vital clue. Marriages within the family network strained under the weight of grief. Martha and Thomas, once a supportive team, began to argue more frequently, their differences in coping creating tension. Small disagreements, a forgotten grocery item, an unattended phone call, would escalate into heated arguments, always anchored to the unspoken anxiety over Abigail's fate. Friends also faced fractures in relationships, as guilt and fear reshaped social dynamics. Some families relocated entirely, leaving Montpelier to escape the constant reminder of the unresolved tragedy. Community struggles and psychological toll. The town itself felt the invisible weight of Abigail's disappearance. Residents whispered about strangers, kept children close, and questioned the safety of places that had once seemed secure. Anxiety became a quiet undercurrent in everyday life, influencing routines and decisions in subtle ways. Local businesses reported a decrease in evening foot traffic near the Riverside Trail, once a popular spot for walkers and artists. Teachers noticed children more hesitant during outdoor activities, parents more protective, neighbors more suspicious. Mental health struggles were common but largely unacknowledged. Counseling resources were limited, and societal understanding of trauma was far less developed than it is today. Families and friends coped privately, often internalizing fear, guilt, and grief. Decades later, many would recount years of insomnia, chronic anxiety, and depression stemming directly from the case. The psychological toll was compounded by the lack of closure and the seeming permanence of uncertainty. The case gradually becomes cold. As months turned into years, Abigail Harper's case became emblematic of small-town heartbreak and investigative limitation. With leads drying up, suspects cleared, and forensic technology unable to provide new insights, the case gradually cooled. Police maintained minimal periodic follow-ups, checking in with the family, scanning for any new information, but the initial momentum had long since dissipated. For the community, Abigail's absence became a quiet ache, present but often unspoken, a ghost of the girl who had brought light and curiosity to their streets. Yet within this apparent stalemate, hints lingered, dramatic ironies that the audience could perceive even as the investigators struggled. Early witness statements included details that seemed inconsequential: the loitering van, the fleeting presence of a man at the library, the fabric fragments on Abigail's coat. At the time, they were catalogued but not fully understood, misinterpreted or dismissed due to limitations in forensic science and investigative methodology. Decades later, these overlooked clues would converge, forming a clear line toward the true perpetrator, an insight unavailable to anyone at the time, yet painfully obvious to the audience in hindsight. The audience could also see patterns in the behavior of early suspects and bystanders, subtle evasions in testimony, inconsistencies in alibis, and minor details that might have hinted at guilt. These moments of dramatic irony created tension, a sense that the truth was hidden in plain sight, waiting for modern techniques and fresh eyes to uncover it. Family holding on to hope. Despite the cold nature of the investigation and the passing years, Abigail's family refused to relinquish hope entirely. Martha Harper maintained a daily routine that included revisiting the river trail, checking in with neighbors, and maintaining contact with law enforcement. Thomas Harper continued meticulous records of Abigail's activities before her disappearance, preserving receipts, notes, and letters as potential evidence for the day justice might come. David Harper, now in his late 20s, took it upon himself to review old reports, hoping that a forgotten detail might resurface. Friends also held on to hope, maintaining their connections with the family and speaking of Abigail in stories, art, and memory. Every anniversary of her disappearance brought gatherings at the river path, small vigils marked by candlelight and quiet reflection. These acts of remembrance sustained the family and community, reinforcing that Abigail's life, though violently cut short, was not forgotten. Even as hope persisted, it existed alongside a pervasive anxiety, the fear that the case might never be solved, that the person responsible would escape accountability, and that the lives of those left behind would remain permanently marked by grief and unanswered questions. The juxtaposition of hope and despair became a defining element of the Harper family's existence, a tension that would not resolve until the breakthrough decades later. The legacy of the early years. These initial years, though marked by frustration and dead ends, set the stage for everything that would follow. The investigators' diligence, even with its limitations, preserved evidence that would later become pivotal. The emotional imprint on the family and community maintained a thread of memory and attention that prevented Abigail's case from fading entirely into obscurity. And the overlooked clues, the van, the fabric fragments, the strange chemical traces, remained in waiting, ready to converge when the right technology and persistence could finally uncover the truth. The audience, aware of these overlooked details, could sense the inevitability of eventual justice, even as the characters themselves navigated years of uncertainty. The dramatic irony, subtle but persistent, underscores the cruelty of time in cold cases. So many answers were always there, just out of reach. For nearly 4 decades, Abigail Harper's life would remain suspended between memory and mystery. The town carried her absence like a silent ache. The family held hope against despair. The investigation, though stalled, quietly preserved the breadcrumbs that would eventually lead to resolution. And somewhere, beyond the immediate perception of Montpelier and its residents, the truth waited, patient, meticulous, and almost impossibly close, ready for the day it could finally be revealed. Community legends and urban myths. Vermont murder solved after nearly 40 years. As Abigail Harper's case gradually cooled into a cold file, Montpelier's quiet streets took on a darker, almost haunted quality. The town, already tight-knit, began to weave its own narratives around her disappearance, a mixture of fact, rumor, and imagination. What had once been ordinary streets and familiar paths became charged with unease, transformed by whispered stories and a persistent absence of closure. The trail becomes a playground for fear and folklore. Children, drawn both by curiosity and the thrill of danger, began daring one another to approach the riverside trail where Abigail had last been seen. It started innocuously, passing notes in school about Abigail's path or the frozen trail late in winter, but over the years, the tales grew more elaborate. Some claimed to have seen flickering lights among the trees, while others whispered about a shadowy figure lurking behind the copse of evergreens. Local kids would tell each other that if you walked the trail after sunset, you could hear her voice calling, faint and beckoning. Of course, no one ever confirmed it, but the legend persisted, passed from one group of children to the next. Parents would warn their own kids to stay home, citing not only the risk of the trail but the possibility that Abigail's ghost might still wander the woods. These stories, though fictionalized in the telling, kept the memory of the victim alive in the town consciousness and created a sense of tension that lingered in the winter air. Strange sightings and unexplained events. Over time, adults also contributed to the mythology. Drivers reported seeing lights on the riverside trail late at night, flickering in a pattern that didn't match any known camping equipment. Joggers recalled feeling watched, as if unseen eyes followed them along familiar paths. A local fisherman claimed to have spotted a figure standing silently by the riverbank in the early morning mist, only to find the spot empty when he returned later. While these accounts were anecdotal, they took on significance in the collective imagination. Neighbors began speaking in hushed tones about strangers in town, people passing through who might know more than they admitted. Small businesses noted that patrons occasionally inquired vaguely about Abigail's disappearance, sometimes framing questions as idle curiosity, sometimes as probing inquiries into the town's memory. The fabric of the community itself became entwined with the legend, blending fear with fascination. Whispered theories and persistent questions. Rumors flourished where facts could not. Some claimed Abigail had been taken by someone from out of town, a drifter or itinerant worker who vanished as quickly as he appeared. Others theorized that a local resident, someone seemingly ordinary, had acted on a long-held grudge. Each retelling added nuance, distortion, or moral judgment. At school, students passed along secret stories, speculating about motives and possible culprits. At cafes and grocery stores, neighbors exchanged low, conspiratorial conversations about who might have been the last to see her alive. One popular theory suggested that Abigail had discovered something she shouldn't have, evidence of petty crime, or a hidden secret in the library where she worked, and paid the price for it. Though entirely speculative, this notion persisted, partly because it lent a sense of order to chaos. If there was a reason, at least it was understandable, even if terrifying. Urban legends intertwine with reality. Some of the legends contained kernels of truth that, at the time, no one recognized. The dark sedan, spotted on the streets days before Abigail vanished, became a recurring motif in stories of ghostly sightings. Children described seeing it parked at odd hours, while adults noted mysterious cars that appeared and disappeared in the vicinity of the trail. The fabric fragments found on Abigail's coat, misunderstood in 1987, were later mirrored in children's tales of a stranger's cloak left behind in the snow. Even small details, the faint metallic scent reported near the trail, footprints that ended abruptly, entered the folklore. People spoke of invisible footsteps or traces that vanish, as though the very environment conspired to hide the truth. In this way, the urban myths foreshadowed the eventual revelations of the reopened investigation, encoding clues in rumor long before technology could confirm them. Impact on town atmosphere. The legends affected daily life in subtle ways. Evening walks became less frequent, residents took different routes to avoid the trail, children's outdoor play changed to accommodate fear of unseen observers. Seasonal events, like winter festivals or school hikes, carried an unspoken tension. Everyone knew the story of Abigail Harper, everyone remembered where she had been last seen, and everyone carried the faint anxiety that someone, or something, might still be present. Business owners reported a noticeable shift as well. Cafes once popular with young adults experienced quieter nights, and local artists avoided sketching near the riverbank, concerned about the lingering aura of tragedy. Teachers incorporated cautionary tales into lessons, warning students about the consequences of wandering alone after dark. Even casual conversations carried undertones of suspicion and vigilance. The town itself, long accustomed to peace and familiarity, had been subtly reshaped by absence and fear. Family experience within the mythology. For the Harper family, the myths were a double-edged sword. On one hand, the stories kept Abigail's memory alive, ensuring that she was never forgotten. On the other hand, the exaggerations and misinterpretations caused fresh grief. Martha Harper sometimes found herself reading letters or hearing rumors that seemed almost to blame the family for failing to protect her daughter. Friends shared stories that veered towards superstition, mixing fact with fiction, creating a confusing tapestry of memory, loss, and community storytelling. Despite this, the family remained committed to distinguishing truth from myth. Martha meticulously recorded credible witness accounts, while David Harper kept old police reports organized, highlighting factual details and discarding rumor. Thomas Harper, quieter but no less observant, often revisited the Riverside Trail, checking the snow and noting disturbances that could hold a clue. In this way, the family straddled two worlds, one of living grief and one of carefully documented evidence, ensuring that when the case was reopened decades later, they could separate legend from reality, foreshadowing the eventual truth. The legends, subtle and pervasive, unwittingly foreshadowed critical elements of the case that would ultimately lead to resolution. Children's stories of shadowy figures, vehicles parked oddly, and fleeting glimpses aligned with the suspect's pattern of surveillance. Whispered adult theories about an outsider, someone meticulous and careful, paralleled what investigators would eventually uncover. Even the fabricated details, the cloak, the invisible footprints, echoed real forensic clues that had been recorded but misunderstood in the original investigation. For the audience, these myths provided dramatic tension and insight. While the townspeople and family wrestled with fear and imagination, the audience could recognize the seeds of truth hidden within rumor. The dark sedan, the unknown figure, the disturbances in snow and fabric, these were not mere fantasy. They were encoded observations waiting for the technology, persistence, and investigative skill that would eventually uncover the truth. Enduring legacy. As the years passed, Abigail Harper's disappearance became more than a crime story. It became part of Montpelier's identity. Trails and riverbanks, cafes and libraries, all carried subtle reminders of that winter in 1987. The stories evolved with each passing generation, blending horror, memory, and fascination. Children dared each other near the trail, whispering of ghostly footsteps. Adults debated motives and suspects. Families navigated a landscape where folklore and reality were inseparable. Yet within this enduring mythology, the essential truth remained. Abigail had been taken, a life ended violently, and someone had known exactly how to leave the scene looking ordinary. The legends, while exaggerated and distorted over time, preserved memory, kept attention alive, and foreshadowed the eventual breakthrough that would bring the perpetrator to justice. Montpelier had learned to live with the tension between fact and story, memory and imagination, fear and hope. And somewhere in the quiet shadows of the town, the traces of truth persisted, waiting patiently for the day when forensic science, persistence, and human resolve would finally illuminate the darkness that had lingered for nearly 4 decades. The catalyst event, Vermont murder solved after nearly 40 years. It had been 38 years since Abigail Harper vanished. Montpelier had learned to live with the absence, the questions, and the hushed whispers that never quite went away. For the Harper family, hope had become a quiet ember, alive, but dimmed by decades of waiting. Yet in the early months of 2025, what began as a routine check in the state's cold case unit would ignite a chain of events that finally set the investigation ablaze. A routine audit sparks attention. The Vermont State Police had recently upgraded its cold case review procedures. Part of the initiative involved digitizing decades-of-old files, cataloging evidence, and cross-referencing unresolved cases with new forensic databases. Officer Rachel Donovan, a young analyst with a reputation for meticulous attention to detail, was assigned to Abigail Harper's case. Her first task seemed simple: review the preserved evidence, ensure nothing had been lost or mislabeled, and input findings into the state database. As she examined the original photographs and catalog sheets, one detail caught her eye: a fragment of fabric noted in the original 1987 report. It had been collected near Abigail's coat, tucked carefully into a paper envelope and labeled as possible foreign fiber. At the time, investigators had been unable to match it to any known source. The notation in the margin suggested only that it had been set aside for future review, pending identification. Donovan recognized it immediately as the kind of minor evidence that modern forensic analysis could now handle with precision. The first breakthrough. Using state-of-the-art fiber analysis and genetic testing, Donovan submitted the fragment for microscopic and DNA examination. The initial results were unremarkable, but a secondary screening, this time using more advanced genetic extraction techniques, produced an unexpected match. The DNA embedded in the fibers belonged to an individual who had not previously been associated with the case, someone entirely off the original investigator's radar. At first, the lead seemed minor. The person in question, according to public records, lived in a neighboring county and had no known connection to Abigail Harper. It could have been a coincidental transfer, perhaps from a stranger passing through town, or a previously unrecorded visitor. But Donovan knew enough about cold cases to recognize that even a single genetic match was far from trivial. It warranted further investigation. A witness comes forward. While the DNA results were being processed, another development occurred. An elderly man, Henry Calloway, contacted the Vermont State Police with a claim that startled investigators. Calloway, a retired delivery driver in his late 70s, stated that he had witnessed something unusual the day Abigail disappeared, but had been too frightened to come forward decades earlier. In his statement, Calloway described a dark sedan parked near the Riverside Trail around the time Abigail was last seen. He recalled seeing a man, unfamiliar to him, loitering nearby, appearing to observe Abigail as she walked toward the trail. At the time, Calloway had assumed the sight was inconsequential. In 1987, he had kept his distance and never reported it. Fear of retaliation and a belief that it was probably nothing had silenced him for decades. When investigators cross-referenced Calloway's description with the fiber DNA match, an unexpected pattern emerged. The witness's account, once an unverified anecdote, now aligned with physical evidence in a way that could not be ignored. The dark sedan, the stranger in the vicinity, the preserved fiber, all converged into a tangible lead. Reopening the investigation. Detectives Alejandro Ramirez and Emily Carter, seasoned officers in the cold case unit, were assigned to follow up. They began retracing Abigail's steps, guided both by the old case files and the newly surfaced evidence. Interviews with surviving witnesses were revisited, with fresh questions aimed at clarifying inconsistencies. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses, archival recordings from 1987 stored on outdated tapes, was painstakingly digitized. Small details previously overlooked now took on renewed significance. The time discrepancies in eyewitness accounts, once dismissed as minor memory lapses, now pointed to a narrow window in which Abigail had encountered her eventual assailant. The parked sedan, initially reported only in passing, could now be cross-referenced with vehicle registrations and sightings from neighbors who had never been questioned fully. Evidence begins to snowball. The fiber DNA lead, initially perceived as minor, began to snowball. Investigators discovered that the individual matched a profile in a national criminal database, someone with a history of theft, trespassing, and other offenses that placed them in proximity to Abigail's routine paths. Travel records, employment logs, and prior addresses painted a portrait of a man who had moved frequently, often residing near small towns and rural areas, minimizing the likelihood of detection. Detectives also revisited the preserved evidence from the Riverside Trail. Footwear impressions, once degraded and inconclusive, were reanalyzed using modern imaging techniques. The pattern matched the size and tread of the suspect's shoes, further linking him to the scene. Investigators began to see how seemingly disconnected elements, the fibers, the footprints, and the witness's decades-old observation, formed a coherent picture pointing toward a single individual. Family reaction and emotional stakes. When Martha Harper received the call from the cold case unit informing her that a promising lead had emerged, she was overwhelmed. "I thought this day would never come," she whispered, voice trembling. Thomas Harper, who had long buried hope beneath years of quiet grief, allowed himself the smallest flicker of optimism. David Harper, who had spent decades reviewing old files and tracing every hint of evidence, felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The investigation had taken a new turn, and for the first time in nearly 4 decades, justice seemed possible. Friends and community members also reacted with cautious hope. People who had shared in the collective anxiety of Abigail's disappearance now saw the possibility that the perpetrator might be identified, finally bringing closure to a story that had defined the town's collective consciousness for generations. Dramatic irony and audience awareness. For the audience, the significance of this catalyst event is immediate. The fiber, so carefully preserved but dismissed decades earlier, now becomes a key puzzle piece. The elderly witness's decades-long silence adds tension. Viewers can see that the answer had been within reach, had circumstances aligned earlier. Dramatic irony heightens the suspense, as the audience recognizes that years of delay were not merely the result of negligence, they were the natural consequence of technological and societal limitations. The investigation gains momentum. With the catalyst event established, detectives ramped up their efforts. They coordinated with state and federal agencies, cross-checking all available databases. Every lead, no matter how minor, was pursued with renewed vigor. Interviews were scheduled with past acquaintances of the suspect, and employment and travel histories were reconstructed. Investigators even reached out to neighboring towns where the suspect had previously resided, piecing together a mobility pattern that suggested premeditation and careful planning. Even small details, the chemical residue at the Riverside Trail, the fabric fragments location on Abigail's coat, and the subtle inconsistencies in original witness statements, were re-examined. Each element now contributed to a coherent theory of the crime, one that had been obscured for decades but was finally coming into focus. Conclusion: the catalyst's role. What had started as a routine review of archived evidence had become the spark that reignited a decades-old investigation. The fiber fragment, once overlooked, now provided a tangible genetic lead. The elderly witness, finally brave enough to speak, supplied the corroborating context that tied the physical evidence to human observation. Together, these minor events snowballed into a critical lead, setting the stage for the next phase, the reopened investigation, where detectives would begin to methodically close in on the suspect. The catalyst event serves as a turning point not only in the investigation but in the emotional arc of the story. Hope, dormant for nearly 4 decades, resurfaces. The audience, aware of the overlooked details and the painstaking care with which investigators are reconstructing the past, anticipates the coming breakthroughs. And for Abigail Harper's family and the Montpelier community, a sense of impending justice begins to replace decades of grief and uncertainty. Reopened investigation, Vermont murder solved after nearly 40 years. The catalyst event, DNA from the preserved fabric and the decades-old witness statement, had transformed Abigail Harper's cold case from a quiet file into a full-scale investigation once again. For detectives Alejandro Ramirez and Emily Carter, what had begun as a routine review now demanded a painstaking reconstruction of events that stretched nearly 4 decades into the past. Every lead, every scrap of paper, and every recollection had to be revisited with the lens of modern investigative techniques, but this also meant grappling with the tension between what was once considered credible and what new technology could reveal. Retracing old steps. Ramirez and Carter began their work at the Riverside Trail where Abigail had last been seen. The path had changed over the years, trees had grown, trails had shifted, and some old landmarks were gone, but the detectives moved slowly, comparing the present landscape with photographs from 1987. Footprints, once thought insignificant, were now re-examined using modern imaging and 3D scanning technology. Although the physical impressions were long faded, soil analysis provided minute details about the type of footwear, corroborating the size and tread pattern indicated by the old footwear evidence. Next, they revisited the library where Abigail had worked. Volunteers and former co-workers were interviewed again, and old security logs were revisited. Questions focused not just on who had seen her, but on the small, overlooked details, conversations she might have had with strangers, delivery personnel who came through, and the timing of shifts. One retired staff member recalled a man who had visited the library repeatedly in the days leading up to Abigail's disappearance. He had been polite but insistent, asking questions that now, in hindsight, seemed intrusive. These subtle recollections, once dismissed as trivial, were now cross-referenced with the suspect's historical travel records and employment logs. Payroll receipts, previously stored in cardboard boxes, revealed that the individual in question had been working in a town only 40 minutes from Montpelier during the week of Abigail's disappearance. Travel receipts showed he had purchased gas along a route that intersected with the Riverside Trail, placing him in proximity with her movements. Even old photographs submitted for unrelated purposes, family snapshots, high school reunion images, showed him in a vehicle matching the dark sedan witnesses described decades earlier. Uncovering lies and misstatements. Interviewing surviving witnesses uncovered inconsistencies in their original statements. Some had unintentionally misremembered times or the exact order of events. Others had actively withheld details out of fear or embarrassment. Ramirez and Carter approached these revelations with care, aware that memory is imperfect, yet recognizing that even small distortions could be pivotal. One former neighbor admitted, decades after the fact, that he had seen the suspect loitering near Abigail's apartment but had not reported it because he assumed someone else had already done so. Another witness confessed to underestimating the frequency of the man's visits to Montpelier, a subtle omission that had originally skewed the investigation. Collectively, these reinterpretations of human memory created a more coherent timeline, aligning with the physical evidence in a way that previous investigators had never been able to assemble. Evidence reinterpreted through modern technology. Forensic advancements played a crucial role. DNA analysis of the fiber fragment, once marginal due to limited technology, now provided a definitive match with the suspect. Chemical residue found near the trail, originally deemed inconsequential, was analyzed with high-precision mass spectrometry, revealing traces of a rare industrial solvent linked to the suspect's prior employment. Soil samples and pollen traces on Abigail's coat were revisited, revealing that she had been near a construction site along the river, a location where the suspect had been working at the time. Letters from the suspect's employer, previously ignored as routine correspondence, were examined for context. Travel logs revealed that he had lied about his whereabouts during the critical week, claiming to be on a business trip when payroll and gas receipts placed him squarely in the area. Surveillance of old photographs, combined with vehicle registration checks, confirmed the presence of the suspect's dark sedan along streets near Abigail's last known route. Each piece of evidence, when reconsidered in light of modern techniques, fit together like a mosaic. Where 1987 investigators had seen fragments, Ramirez and Carter saw patterns. Where witnesses had offered fragmented recollections, they now saw corroborating details. The case began to coalesce into a singular narrative pointing directly at one individual. Tension between old and new investigative methods. While modern techniques revealed crucial breakthroughs, Ramirez and Carter also encountered friction between old and new methods. Retired officers, who had worked the original case, expressed skepticism about relying heavily on DNA and digital reconstructions. They argued that human observation and intuition had solved cases long before these tools existed. Ramirez, however, reminded them that the case had remained unsolved precisely because the limits of 1987's technology had prevented investigators from seeing the connections now coming into focus. The detectives found themselves walking a tightrope between honoring the meticulous work of the past and challenging its assumptions. They held careful briefings with retired officers, showing them how reinterpretation of logs, travel receipts, and physical evidence now painted a consistent picture. The tension was palpable. Some former investigators bristled at the suggestion that their initial conclusions had overlooked critical details, while others quietly acknowledged that new technology had finally unlocked what had eluded them for decades. Piecing together a timeline. With the combination of new evidence and revisited witness statements, Ramirez and Carter reconstructed Abigail Harper's final hours in unprecedented detail. She had left the library in the late afternoon, taking the Riverside Trail on her usual route home. A vehicle matching the description of the dark sedan was observed parked near the trail. Footprints indicated a man had been following her discreetly. The industrial solvent traces, previously unnoticed, were consistent with handling by the suspect at his workplace earlier that day, linking him directly to the scene. The detectives cross-referenced every detail: witness accounts, physical evidence, travel receipts, and employment records. Each independent source of information converged on the same conclusion: the suspect had opportunity, proximity, and motive to commit the crime. Even minor details, like the placement of a discarded coat button found decades later in the underbrush, aligned with the reconstructed timeline, reinforcing the growing certainty. Community response to renewed investigation. News of the case reopening spread quietly at first. Families and friends of Abigail Harper were cautiously optimistic. Local residents, long accustomed to whispered theories and urban legends, were now witnessing investigators actively pursuing tangible leads. The community felt a mixture of relief and apprehension: relief that justice was finally within reach, and apprehension that the investigation might uncover uncomfortable truths about someone who had lived among them for decades. Community members provided further insight as detectives canvassed neighborhoods, seeking anyone who might recall seemingly insignificant details from 1987. Old photographs, letters, and even diaries were reviewed, revealing minor observations that had once been overlooked but now contributed meaningfully to the timeline. Tension builds toward confrontation. As the evidence mounted, Ramirez and Carter realized they were closing in. The suspect, who had long faded into relative obscurity, was being watched carefully. Surveillance and investigation confirmed patterns of movement and behavior that matched the reconstructed events. Every piece of overlooked evidence, every previously misinterpreted log, and every witness recollection contributed to a portrait of a man whose careful planning had gone unnoticed for decades, but who now stood exposed under the scrutiny of modern investigation. The detectives also faced the challenge of maintaining secrecy. Word of a renewed investigation could tip off the suspect, prompting flight or destruction of evidence. They coordinated discreetly with state authorities, ensuring that each step, interviews, evidence collection, and verification, was handled without alerting the individual being investigated. Conclusion: momentum shifts. By the end of the reopened investigation phase, the cold case had transformed from a decades-old mystery into a clear, actionable scenario. Investigators possessed a reconstructed timeline, corroborated by both reinterpreted evidence and modern forensic analysis. Lies, omissions, and oversights from the original investigation had been uncovered and corrected, and the suspect had been placed in proximity to the crime at critical times. The tension between old and new investigative methods underscored the complexity of cold cases. Decades of human memory, flawed recollections, and limited technology had initially obscured the truth, but modern science, combined with meticulous detective work, had illuminated a path toward justice. The stage was now set for the next phase: closing in on the suspect, gathering final evidence, and preparing for the moment when decades of frustration, grief, and uncertainty would culminate in confrontation. Closing in on the suspect: Vermont murder solved after nearly 40 years. The months of painstaking review, modern forensic analysis, and painstaking interviews had finally brought detectives Alejandro Ramirez and Emily Carter to a singular conclusion. There was one individual who fit every detail of the reconstructed timeline, every physical clue, and every eyewitness account. The suspect, long presumed harmless in Montpelier's quiet streets, had been hiding in plain sight. Yet even as the evidence mounted, the detectives knew that nothing in cold case work could be rushed. Every step had to be deliberate, every move measured. One misstep could allow decades of progress to slip away. Past shadows, motive emerges. Flashbacks to the 1980s began to intertwine with the present investigation, revealing subtle threads that had gone unnoticed for years. The suspect, a transient figure who had worked multiple odd jobs across Vermont and neighboring states, had cultivated relationships in Montpelier that appeared benign on the surface. But review of old employment records, letters, and personal correspondences suggested a deeper, darker pattern. Investigators discovered that the suspect had been involved in petty thefts and incidents of intimidation, often targeting individuals who lived alone or were vulnerable. Abigail Harper, by her own nature curious, diligent, and socially engaged, had unwittingly crossed paths with him in ways that, in retrospect, created both opportunity and motive. A letter from a former co-worker hinted at an argument between Abigail and the suspect over library inventory, a minor dispute at the time, but now potentially significant. Other notes suggested he resented her perceived judgment, a quiet irritation that, unchecked, could escalate. Present-day, surveillance titans. In the present, Ramirez and Carter initiated round-the-clock surveillance. Every movement of the suspect was logged: daily routines, errands, and interactions. The detectives monitored the suspect's phone, digital correspondence, and vehicle usage. At first, nothing seemed overtly incriminating. The suspect behaved with careful restraint, avoiding obvious missteps. But subtle tells began to emerge, small contradictions in his statements, fleeting nervous gestures, and an unusual frequency of check-ins at locations related to the Riverside Trail. On one occasion, a neighbor reported seeing him pacing in his driveway late at night, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder. On another, he abruptly cancelled an appointment without explanation, claiming he had forgotten a commitment. Ramirez noted the pattern. Decades of secrecy and careful planning could not erase instinctual anxiety under scrutiny. The detectives recorded every detail, knowing that the cumulative weight of these small behaviors often proved just as telling as hard evidence. Interviews, cracks in the story. Interviewing acquaintances from the 1980s further exposed inconsistencies. A former co-worker claimed the suspect had been in Montpelier during the week of Abigail's disappearance, contradicting the alibi he had provided years ago. Another friend recalled seeing him near the Riverside Trail, an observation the suspect had previously denied. These contradictions, when combined with the fiber DNA match and travel receipts, painted a portrait of a man whose memory, intentions, and presence could no longer be trusted. Carter noted a particular pattern. When pressed with indirect questions, the suspect's responses would shift slightly, his voice rising or hesitating. Micro-expressions, fleeting grimaces, tightened lips, rapid blinking, betrayed the careful facade he attempted to maintain. Every slip-up, no matter how minor, became a thread to pull. Investigators also observed subtle obsessive behaviors. He repeatedly checked doors, cleaned surfaces obsessively, and appeared unusually attuned to anyone near his property. While each act alone seemed benign, together they formed a pattern of guilt and tension. Parallel timelines, past and present. Ramirez constructed a dual narrative for the team. In the past, the suspect's movements, minor altercations, and seemingly trivial disputes with Abigail were mapped meticulously. In the present, surveillance footage, GPS logs, and witness statements were overlaid, creating a digital map that aligned precisely with the reconstructed timeline of 1987. The tension between these timelines was palpable. The audience, aware of past interactions and motives, could see how carefully the suspect had hidden in plain sight. In real time, the detectives watched as he repeated behaviors consistent with the historical profile, checking the perimeter of his property, avoiding certain streets, and obsessively monitoring communications. The convergence of past and present created a narrative rhythm, a suspenseful pulse that signaled the suspect's world was beginning to unravel. Unraveling, the suspect's tells. The subtle cracks in the suspect's demeanor became increasingly pronounced. During a carefully staged meeting under the guise of a routine follow-up, he contradicted himself regarding his whereabouts, fumbling over dates he had previously claimed were precise. Surveillance footage captured him rifling through old boxes in his basement, hastily discarding documents that might link him to Montpelier in 1987. On another occasion, the detectives observed him attempting to dispose of a vehicle, one that matched descriptions from decades-old witness accounts, without explanation. The precision of his past planning could not compensate for decades of exposure and investigative scrutiny. He was now acting in ways that were erratic, contradictory, and increasingly transparent to trained eyes. Even his social interactions reflected tension. Conversations with former colleagues and neighbors revealed an undercurrent of defensiveness and impatience. He would laugh too loudly at minor jokes, redirect discussions abruptly, or insist on control over narratives, subtle psychological indicators that his composure was deteriorating. Ramirez noted that these small tells, when combined with concrete evidence, indicated a breaking point approaching. Evidence convergence. By late spring, the pieces had aligned. The fiber DNA, the witness account, the travel receipts, the reinterpreted payroll and letters, and the suspect's behavioral tells. All pointed unequivocally toward one conclusion. The suspect had been present, had opportunity, and had motive. Investigators consolidated all data into a comprehensive briefing. Graphs and timelines overlaid physical evidence, witness statements, and digital reconstructions. Every contradiction, every slip-up, every subtle tell was documented and correlated with historical events. For the first time, a 360-degree portrait of the suspect emerged, one that left little room for doubt. Building the net. With confirmation in hand, Ramirez and Carter began planning the approach. Coordination with state and federal authorities ensured that every legal step was followed. Warrants for search, seizure, and surveillance were obtained, and a tactical plan was developed to prevent flight or destruction of evidence. The detectives recognized that after decades of careful concealment, the suspect was likely to react unpredictably if he suspected the net closing around him. Tension built as surveillance intensified. Every movement was logged: morning coffee runs, trips to the post office, short walks along familiar routes. Investigators noted that he no longer left home without carefully checking his surroundings, signaling a heightened awareness of being watched. For Ramirez and Carter, this nervous behavior confirmed what the evidence already suggested. The suspect was aware, consciously or subconsciously, that the walls were closing in. Community awareness and emotional stakes. The Harper family, informed periodically about the progress, began to feel hope ripple through decades of grief. Martha Harper, who had long resigned herself to uncertainty, felt cautious optimism, while Thomas Harper allowed himself to imagine Abigail's name finally cleared of ambiguity. Friends and neighbors, many of whom had long speculated about Abigail's disappearance, watched with a mix of fascination and apprehension. The tension was collective. Montpelier itself seemed to hold its breath as the investigation approached its climactic phase, foreshadowing the arrest. The audience, aware of the careful buildup of evidence, behavioral tells, and converging timelines, experiences heightened suspense. Every surveillance observation, every contradiction, every nervous habit serves as a signal that confrontation is imminent. Dramatic irony emphasizes the stakes. Viewers know the detectives have enough to act, but they also know the suspect remains oblivious, or only partially aware, of the depth of the net closing around him. Conclusion: approaching the climax. By the end of this phase, the investigation had reached its critical juncture. Ramirez and Carter possessed not only a reconstructed timeline and corroborated evidence but also an acute understanding of the suspect's psychological state. The combination of past motive, historical missteps, and present-day behavior had created an environment in which the suspect could no longer maintain his careful facade. The detectives prepared to move toward the arrest, knowing that the culmination of decades-long investigation, painstaking evidence gathering, and careful surveillance would soon confront the suspect with undeniable truth. The tension was electric, both for the community and for the audience. Nearly 40 years of silence, fear, and uncertainty were about to converge into a moment of reckoning. The arrest and confession: Vermont murder solved after nearly 40 years. The night was unusually still for Montpelier. A faint chill lingered in the early May air, rustling through the budding trees along the riverside trail where Abigail Harper had last been seen decades ago. Detectives Alejandro Ramirez and Emily Carter had spent months building this moment, ensuring every precaution was taken. After decades of waiting, the culmination of painstaking investigation was finally at hand. Approach and arrest. The suspect's home had been under discreet surveillance for several days. He had begun to exhibit increased signs of nervousness, frequent pacing, checking over his shoulder, and repeated, hurried trips to his basement storage. Ramirez and Carter, accompanied by a small tactical unit, arrived quietly just after dusk. Their approach was methodical, measured, and precise, emphasizing containment rather than confrontation. The suspect answered the door, initially calm but tense, as though he sensed the inevitability of this encounter. Ramirez introduced himself and Carter, explaining the purpose of their visit with clear authority but without theatrics. The suspect's composure faltered almost immediately. His eyes darted, hands fidgeted, and his voice, when he spoke, wavered slightly. He claimed ignorance at first, the rehearsed denials feeling thin against the weight of decades of evidence. Once officers obtained a formal arrest warrant, the suspect was read his rights. Ramirez noticed the subtle signs of unraveling that had been building over weeks: a trembling hand, a rapid intake of breath, and a barely perceptible shiver as he stepped outside. No words could conceal what the evidence had already revealed. The net of truth had closed. Confronting the past. At the station, detectives led the suspect into an interview room. Carter remained calm, professional, and patient, aware that the suspect's psychological defenses were fragile and that any rush could compromise the integrity of the confession. The room was quiet, stripped of distractions. Photographs of Abigail Harper and key pieces of evidence, travel receipts, letters, and fiber samples, were presented, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Initially, the suspect denied involvement. His recollections were vague, inconsistent, and unconvincing. Ramirez calmly walked him through the timeline, juxtaposing historical documents with modern forensic evidence. DNA evidence was presented, fingerprints, travel records, and witness statements, each fact laid out without embellishment. The weight of the data, combined with the subtle psychological pressure of truth laid bare, began to erode his defenses. The confession. Hours into the interrogation, the suspect's story began to crack. Small contradictions, once carefully hidden, became impossible to reconcile with the growing body of evidence. Eventually, he slumped into his chair, silent for a long moment, before quietly admitting his role in Abigail Harper's disappearance. The confession was measured, devoid of theatrics. He recounted events in a low voice, describing the encounter along the Riverside Trail and the mistakes that led to Abigail's death. There was no justification, no plea for sympathy, just the bare facts of his actions, stark and chilling in their simplicity. Detectives documented every word, aware that decades of waiting had finally yielded clarity. Family reaction. The news reached the Harper family slowly, filtered through careful communication by law enforcement. Martha Harper, who had spent nearly 40 years holding on to hope, was overcome with emotion. "I can't believe it's finally over," she whispered, tears streaming. Thomas Harper, silent for so long, allowed himself to feel relief and sorrow simultaneously, a mingling of grief for what had been lost and gratitude for the truth finally emerging. Even after the confession, the family's emotions were complex. Joy at the resolution was tempered by decades of pain, the lost years that could never be recovered. For David Harper, Abigail's younger brother, there was relief but also lingering bitterness, the understanding that justice, while delivered, could not undo the suffering endured by his family and community. Community response. Montpelier's reaction was cautious but profound. Longtime residents, many of whom had whispered about the case for decades, felt a sense of collective closure. Friends and neighbors of Abigail Harper gathered quietly, some bringing flowers to the Riverside Trail as a symbolic gesture of remembrance and resilience. Local news outlets reported the arrest with sobriety, emphasizing the painstaking work of investigators and the perseverance of the Harper family. The town experienced a shared exhalation, a recognition that a dark chapter had ended, yet an awareness that emotional scars lingered. Conversations reflected both relief and reflection. How could someone live among them undetected for so long? How did decades of fear shape the collective memory of a community? These questions underscored the complexity of closure, even in the face of justice. Lingering emotional impact. Although the suspect was in custody and the confession obtained, the emotional resonance of Abigail Harper's loss remained palpable. Ramirez and Carter recognized that the conclusion of the case did not erase the trauma of decades spent wondering, grieving, and hoping. They accompanied the family to Abigail's memorial site, allowing them a private moment to reflect, mourn, and honor her memory. Investigators documented the emotional arc carefully, understanding that closure in cold cases is rarely absolute. For the Harper family, the confession provided clarity, accountability, and a sense of vindication, but it did not fill the emptiness left by Abigail's absence. For the community, the arrest was a reminder of vigilance, the fragility of trust, and the power of persistence in seeking truth. Subtle reflections. The detectives allowed the scene to remain understated, emphasizing the factual and emotional gravity over melodrama. Ramirez noted the quiet strength of the family. Carter observed the collective exhale of a community long burdened by uncertainty. The arrest was a milestone, but it was also a moment for reflection, a testament to the painstaking, often invisible work of investigators who refused to let a case fade into obscurity. For viewers or readers, the scene underscores the duality of closure. Justice served, yet emotional impact enduring. The arrest and confession provide resolution, yet the story respects the weight of loss, the intricacies of human psychology, and the complexity of community memory. Transition to trial and aftermath. With the suspect now in custody, the investigation shifted toward legal proceedings. The confession would play a pivotal role in court, alongside the mountain of reinterpreted evidence painstakingly collected over decades. The Harper family, while relieved, would need to navigate the trial process, confronting the suspect in a formal setting and processing the emotional reality of Abigail Harper's story being made public. The arrest and confession serve as both narrative climax and emotional pivot, bridging the investigative process with the subsequent judicial resolution. The stage is set for the trial and its aftermath, where the final reckoning, legal, emotional, and communal, will unfold. Trial and aftermath. Vermont murder solved after nearly 40 years. The courtroom was tense, filled with the quiet murmur of anticipation that comes with a trial decades in the making. The Harper family sat together, hands clasped tightly, while community members, journalists, and curious onlookers filled the gallery. After nearly 40 years, Abigail Harper's story was being told in full, not just through whispered memories, old photographs, or police reports, but through legal testimony and forensic evidence carefully reconstructed by detectives Alejandro Ramirez and Emily Carter. Opening statements. The prosecution opened with a deliberate, measured recounting of Abigail's life, the circumstances of her disappearance, and the painstaking investigation that had brought them to this day. Archival photographs were displayed, images of Abigail smiling at the library, walking the Riverside Trail, and celebrating holidays with family. Each photo reinforced her humanity, a subtle but powerful reminder of the life cut tragically short. The defense, in contrast, attempted to challenge the reliability of decades-old evidence. They questioned witness memories, highlighted gaps in the chain of custody, and sought to cast doubt on interpretations of payroll records, travel receipts, and fiber DNA. Their strategy relied heavily on the passage of time, hoping that the jury would find the reconstructed timeline less credible than contemporary testimony. Presentation of evidence. Over the course of the trial, the prosecution meticulously presented the evidence gathered during the reopened investigation. Fiber DNA evidence, once considered marginal, was shown to definitively link the suspect to Abigail's coat. Travel receipts, previously overlooked, demonstrated the suspect's presence near Montpelier during the critical week in 1987. Letters and payroll records, cross-referenced with witness statements and archival photographs, created an airtight chronology of events. Detectives Ramirez and Carter were called to testify, walking the jury through the dual timelines, the historical events of 1987 and the modern reinterpretation of evidence that had brought the suspect into focus. They explained how seemingly minor details, footwear impressions, soil samples, and subtle behavioral cues, had converged to create a coherent narrative. Their testimony was calm but firm, emphasizing methodical investigation over conjecture. Witnesses, some recalling events from nearly 40 years ago, were brought back to testify. While memory is imperfect, the detectives guided the court through corroborated details, helping the jury understand the context and significance of each recollection. Former neighbors, co-workers, and friends described the suspect's behavior, past conflicts with Abigail, and patterns of movement that aligned with the reconstructed timeline. Defense challenges and jury deliberation. The defense attempted to exploit the passage of time, emphasizing inconsistencies in memory and arguing that decades-old evidence could not meet the burden of proof. They suggested alternative interpretations of travel receipts and questioned the reliability of witness recollections. Yet, the combination of DNA evidence, behavioral analysis, and corroborated historical documentation proved overwhelmingly persuasive. The jury deliberated for several days. During that time, the Harper family waited in quiet tension, reflecting on nearly 40 years of unanswered questions. They revisited memories of Abigail, both joyful and painful, and considered the weight of finally confronting the truth in a formal setting. The community watched closely, knowing that this verdict would provide a rare sense of closure for a crime long relegated to rumor and fear. Verdict and sentencing. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreperson delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts of murder and related charges. The reaction in the room was palpable but subdued. For the Harper family, tears mingled with a sense of release. "It's over," whispered Martha Harper, her voice shaking but resolute. Thomas Harper remained quiet, absorbing the finality of the moment while grappling with decades of grief. Sentencing followed shortly after. The judge imposed the maximum penalty allowable under state law, emphasizing the premeditated nature of the crime and the profound impact on the community. The suspect remained expressionless, facing the consequences of actions long concealed, while the Harper family and observers silently acknowledged that justice, though delayed, had finally been served. Reflection on loss and recovery. Even as the legal process concluded, the emotional resonance of Abigail's story remained. The trial highlighted what had been lost, a vibrant life, decades of family experiences, and countless moments that would never be shared. Yet it also illuminated what had been gained, clarity, accountability, and the affirmation that truth, though delayed, can endure. For the Harper family, closure did not erase grief, but it transformed it into something different, a recognition that Abigail's story mattered, that her life had been remembered, and that justice, however delayed, had been achieved. Community members reflected similarly, acknowledging that the decades-long shadow of uncertainty had finally lifted, leaving space for collective healing and remembrance. Impact on the community. Montpelier, a small town accustomed to whispered speculation, experienced a subtle but profound shift. Conversations moved from rumor and suspicion to reflection and understanding. Friends and neighbors recounted memories of Abigail, honoring her presence and legacy rather than focusing solely on the crime. The reopening of the case and its resolution highlighted the persistence of law enforcement, the evolution of forensic science, and the importance of community vigilance. Local schools incorporated discussions of the case in age-appropriate ways, emphasizing civic responsibility, empathy, and the role of perseverance in seeking justice. Community groups held vigils along the Riverside Trail, both to remember Abigail and to recognize the dedication of those who refused to let the case fade into obscurity. Lingering emotional reality. Despite the conviction, emotional scars remained. Families who had grown wary of closure found themselves navigating a complex mixture of relief, sorrow, and lingering trauma. The Harper family, while grateful for the resolution, continued to process decades of uncertainty, moments lost, milestones missed, and the long absence of Abigail's presence in daily life. Detectives Ramirez and Carter reflected on their own experiences, recognizing the profound responsibility inherent in cold case work. Each detail they uncovered, every witness they revisited, and every reinterpretation of evidence had been critical in bringing closure. Yet they understood that for families and communities, resolution is never complete. Emotional recovery takes time, patience, and support beyond the courtroom. Transition to reflection and the bigger picture. With the trial concluded, the narrative naturally shifted from investigation and legal process to broader themes: the persistence of truth, the evolution of investigative techniques, and the lasting impact of crime on families and communities. The Harper family, while relieved, would continue to navigate the aftermath, grieving, remembering, and honoring Abigail in ways that transcended legal outcomes. The stage was now set for reflection. The story could expand beyond the confines of a single trial, considering systemic lessons, societal implications, and the enduring human need for closure. For the detectives, the trial reaffirmed the value of patience, diligence, and the belief that truth, even after decades, can prevail. Reflection and the bigger picture. Vermont murder solved after nearly 40 years. The courtroom lights had dimmed, the press had filed their reports, and the Harper family had returned home, carrying with them a fragile sense of closure. But the reverberations of Abigail Harper's story extended far beyond Montpelier's quiet streets. Nearly 4 decades of waiting, wondering, and grieving had culminated in justice, yet the story left lingering questions about the systems, people, and processes that govern how crimes are investigated, and how long it can take for truth to surface. Persistence as a driving force. One of the clearest lessons of Abigail's case was the enduring power of persistence. Detectives Alejandro Ramirez and Emily Carter demonstrated a commitment to truth that spanned months of painstaking work in the present, decades of historical reconstruction, and a constant attention to detail. Their willingness to revisit overlooked leads, challenge assumptions, and integrate modern forensic methods exemplified the patience required to solve cold cases. For the Harper family, persistence was a personal journey as well. Martha and Thomas Harper had carried the weight of uncertainty for nearly 40 years, navigating grief, rumors, and the slow erosion of hope. Their unwavering determination to honor Abigail's memory and insist upon accountability had played a critical role in keeping her story alive. Persistence, in this context, was both an emotional and investigative force, a reminder that truth often demands endurance as much as intellect. Justice delayed, not denied. The extended timeline of Abigail Harper's case highlighted both the challenges and the moral complexities of delayed justice. While modern forensic technology, dedicated investigators, and meticulous review ultimately brought resolution, the decades-long delay left deep scars. Generations of family members, neighbors, and friends lived with unanswered questions and unprocessed grief. Yet the case also underscored a critical principle: justice, though delayed, need not be denied. The arrest, confession, and conviction of the suspect reaffirmed that the systems in place, however imperfect, could eventually yield accountability. It was a hard-won reminder that the passage of time does not erase culpability, and that legal and investigative perseverance can still provide closure, even after decades of silence. Cold case funding and resource challenges. Abigail Harper's case brought to light broader systemic issues, particularly the chronic underfunding of cold case investigations. Many departments, especially in rural areas like Vermont, lack the personnel, technology, or resources necessary to reopen decades-old investigations effectively. Ramirez and Carter's success was in part due to access to modern DNA analysis, digital record reconstruction, and renewed investigative authority, resources not available to their predecessors in the 1980s. The case illustrated the need for sustained investment in cold case units, forensic laboratories, and cross-jurisdictional collaboration. Had these tools been available earlier, the resolution might have come years sooner, sparing families decades of uncertainty. Policymakers, law enforcement agencies, and communities were reminded that cold cases are not static. They are living investigations, requiring both attention and investment to ensure justice is attainable. Rural policing challenges. Montpelier, like many rural towns, presented unique policing challenges. Limited staffing, geographic isolation, and tight-knit community dynamics often complicate investigations. Witnesses may feel reluctant to come forward, and rumors can cloud fact with speculation. Abigail Harper's disappearance highlighted these difficulties. Early leads were scarce, and the suspect was able to navigate the community without immediate detection. Yet these same dynamics can also aid resolution when approached carefully. Investigators who understand local social networks, community behavior, and long-standing relationships can uncover overlooked evidence, as Ramirez and Carter did when revisiting historical records and conducting meticulous interviews. The case demonstrates that rural policing demands a balance of investigative rigor, community awareness, and patient relationship building. Lessons learned. Several key lessons emerged from the resolution of this cold case. Evidence preservation matters. Even minor details, fibers, receipts, or seemingly insignificant notes can become pivotal decades later. Proper storage, cataloging, and documentation ensure that evidence remains viable for modern reinterpretation. Integration of new technology, advances in DNA analysis, digital forensics, and data cross-referencing can breathe new life into long-dormant investigations. Departments must remain open to technological innovation to maximize the potential of unresolved cases. Psychological insight, behavioral analysis of suspects, including subtle tells, inconsistencies, and reactions under scrutiny, can provide critical leads. Understanding human psychology enhances investigative accuracy and can bridge gaps in physical evidence. Community collaboration, families, neighbors, and witnesses play an essential role in uncovering truth. Maintaining communication, building trust, and validating accounts, even decades later, can yield crucial information. Emotional complexity, closure is rarely absolute. Even after a conviction, families and communities continue to process grief, reflection, and the societal impact of the crime. Justice resolves accountability but cannot fully restore what was lost. Remaining questions. While the suspect's conviction provided legal closure, broader questions lingered. How many other cold cases remain unresolved due to systemic limitations? How can communities and law enforcement prevent similar crimes in the future? And how do we reconcile the emotional toll of decades-long uncertainty with the eventual satisfaction of justice served? The Harper family, while relieved, continues to navigate these questions. They reflect on Abigail's life, the moments stolen from them, and the power of persistence. They also grapple with the collective responsibility of society to invest in resources, support victims' families, and ensure that no story is forgotten, regardless of how much time has passed. Broader societal implications. Abigail Harper's story also illuminated societal issues beyond Montpelier. Cold cases are not merely relics of the past, they are living reminders of the need for diligence, accountability, and innovation in the criminal justice system. Policymakers and law enforcement agencies can take lessons from this case. Prioritizing training, ensuring adequate funding, and fostering collaboration across jurisdictions are essential to resolving the thousands of unsolved cases that remain nationwide. Moreover, the case underscores the importance of empathy and patience in investigative work. Each family's grief is unique, each community's experience distinct, and each case represents countless hours of human effort and emotional investment. Recognizing the human element alongside the forensic and procedural aspects is critical to comprehensive justice. Concluding reflections. As spring transitioned into early summer in Montpelier, the Riverside Trail where Abigail Harper had last been seen became a place of quiet reflection rather than fear. Flowers were placed along the path, community members paused to remember, and the Harper family took tentative steps toward healing. Justice, long delayed, had been achieved, but the scars of loss and uncertainty remained. Detectives Ramirez and Carter continued their work, their experience with this case informing future investigations. They understood that each resolved case strengthens the system, offers closure to families, and restores faith in the persistence of truth. Abigail Harper's story would live on, not only in memories and photographs but also as a testament to the power of patience, diligence, and relentless pursuit of justice. Ultimately, the Vermont murder case solved after nearly 40 years serves as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. It reminds society that justice may take decades but is attainable, that communities and families matter in the pursuit of truth, and that the combined force of persistence, innovation, and human compassion can illuminate even the darkest corners of unsolved crimes. As the Harper family and community began to adjust to this new reality, detectives Ramirez and Carter received a call late one evening. Another disappearance, eerily reminiscent of Abigail's, had occurred in a neighboring county. The details were fragmentary, but the echoes were unmistakable. Similar patterns, similar behavioral clues, similar questions left unanswered. The story, while resolved for Abigail Harper, was not over for the detectives. The pursuit of justice, it seemed, was a continuum, one case closing only to reveal the next mystery waiting in the shadows. The narrative pivoted toward the next challenge, setting the stage for the cliffhanger that would launch the next chapter in this series of long-forgotten crimes brought back into the light. Cliffhanger for next case, Vermont murder solved after nearly 40 years. Detective Alejandro Ramirez sat at his desk late into the night, the dim glow of a single lamp illuminating a stack of cold case files. Emily Carter had left hours ago, her eyes heavy from weeks of relentless investigation, but Ramirez couldn't rest. Even after the resolution of Abigail Harper's case, something tugged at the edges of his mind, an unease that refused to fade with the sense of closure settling over Montpelier. The phone rang, piercing the quiet like a sudden jolt of electricity. Ramirez picked it up, expecting another routine call. Instead, the voice on the other end was tense, hurried, and barely able to contain fear. "Detective Ramirez, you need to come to East Montpelier," the caller said. It's happening again." The words hung in the air. Ramirez frowned, leaning back in his chair. East Montpelier was a neighboring town, quiet and unassuming, much like Montpelier itself. But the urgency in the voice, the weight of unseen details, set off alarms in his mind. "What do you mean, again?" he asked, his tone measured but edged with caution. "There's a body," the caller said. "The circumstances, they're similar to Harper's. Too similar. We need you here now." Ramirez hung up, already reaching for his coat. Within minutes, he and Carter were in the patrol car, headlights cutting through the thick fog that had begun rolling in along the winding Vermont roads. The familiar hum of the engine did little to ease the tension. Both detectives knew that time was critical. As they drove, Ramirez's thoughts drifted back to the Harper case, the Riverside Trail, the painstaking reconstruction of events, the subtle tells that had finally led to the suspect. Could it be a copycat? Or something darker, a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight all along? The questions gnawed at him, sharp and insistent. By the time they arrived, uniformed officers had already cordoned off the scene. Yellow tape flapped in the wind, marking the perimeter of a small clearing near the river's edge. A body had been discovered just off the trail, positioned in a way that mirrored the Harper case, deliberate, unsettling, and too precise to be coincidence. Carter knelt beside the scene, her flashlight sweeping over disturbed earth, faint footprints, and fragments of clothing. Ramirez's gaze fell on a small, worn notebook lying nearby. The handwriting inside was careful, meticulous, but the initials matched nothing in the local records, yet the date, circled in bold red ink, was strikingly familiar. The same time of year Abigail Harper had disappeared, nearly 4 decades ago. A chill ran down Ramirez's spine. The similarities were impossible to ignore: location, timing, behavior, and now this enigmatic notebook. He exchanged a look with Carter, the silent communication between seasoned detectives heavy with unspoken concerns. "This isn't random," Ramirez said quietly. "Someone sending a message, or repeating history." Carter nodded, her eyes scanning the perimeter. "And it's just begun. Whoever did this, they know what they are doing. And they know how we work." The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint, indistinct sounds of the forest at night, rustling leaves, snapping branches, distant animal calls. But beneath them, Ramirez could feel a deeper, more insistent pulse of danger. It was a reminder that for every resolution, every case closed, another shadow waits, patient and unseen. Thank you for watching this video to the end. I am pretty sure you enjoyed it. We have a lot of other interesting and beautiful stories lined up for you already. So click on the image on your screen to watch the next one.